Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a look at opioid prescribing in Maine following 2 years of experience with Chapter 488. My name is Erin Dunn. I am the moderator for today's webinar. To begin, I am going to go over some housekeeping items and provide a general overview for today's webinar. And once I complete that, I will then introduce our presenter for today, and we will go ahead and get started. On my screen, you should see a PowerPoint right now with an introduction slide. Today's date is October 23rd. The webinar is scheduled from 12 to 2 p.m. Audio is available through your computer speakers or by phone by calling the number that you see on the screen. And the webinar code is shown as well. Just so you are aware, the webinar is set to auto mute as participants dial in. If you need to ask a question, either to me as the moderator or to the presenter during the presentation today, please make sure you are using that in your GoToMeeting control panel chat function. Once again, if you are listening just on the phone, in order to get a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please make sure that you join the webinar by clicking on the link that was provided to you in your emails that were sent after you registered. You will need to click on that link and enter your first and last name when prompted by GoToMeeting to do so. This will enable AdCare to take attendance as the webinar goes on. If you would like a certificate of attendance and continuing education for participating, please make sure you are accessing the online webinar with that link that was sent to you. And you will need to enter your name and email in the chat area so we can take attendance. So in the chat function, you'll see that some participants have already wrote in their names and emails for attendance. If you haven't done that already, or if you have people that are listening in on one phone, but there are multiple participants on one phone, just go ahead and type in all the names of the people listening and their email addresses. Once again, your support for today's webinar is provided by myself. My name is Erin Dunn. I am the Workforce Development Project Coordinator here at AdCare. You can find my contact information on the slide in front of you. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of the Maine Medical Association through the joint providership of University of New England and AdCare Educational Institute of Maine. The University of New England is accredited by the Maine Medical Association to provide continuing medical education for physicians. Important webinar notes for you. You are in listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions and make comments in the chat function of GoToMeeting. Your video screen size and location is adjustable in the GoToMeeting control panel. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to today's presentation recording and slides, and a link to our CME CEU survey. CME is available. Disclosure, today's speaker does not have any relevant financial relationships with the manufacturers of any commercial products and/or provider of commercial services discussed in this CME activity. The webinar qualifies for a maximum of 1.5 CME credits of the 3 CME credit requirement for opioid medication education found in PL 2015 Chapter 488, Maine's recent legislation to address the opioid drug abuse crisis. CME will be available for participants who have signed into the live webinar. If you did not log into this webinar with your first, last, and email, please submit your name and email address using the chat feature in your GoToMeeting control panel. You must complete the survey in order to receive a certificate. This is the survey evaluation you will receive via email tomorrow. Please complete the survey within 1 week. A CME certificate will be emailed once the survey has closed. Once again, we need all participants to complete that survey and we have to receive it in order for you to receive your certificate of participation for today's webinar. Certificates of attendance will be awarded 1.5 hours. The webinar qualifies for a maximum of 1.5 CME credits. An email about the survey will go out tomorrow, not later this week. You must complete the survey in order to receive a certificate. Please complete the survey within 1 week. A certificate will be emailed once the survey has closed. I just wanted to reiterate that because I know there will be questions. So once again, if you do have questions about any of this, feel free to contact me after today's webinar and I will be able to assist you. Once again, your feedback is greatly appreciated as well. So those surveys are very important to fill out so that we can get your feedback on today's presentation. And now I will introduce our presenter for today. Gordon H. Smith is the Executive Vice President of the Maine Medical Association. A Maine native, he graduated from the University of Maine with highest distinction in 1973 and from the Boston College Law School, magna cum laude in 1976. He practiced law privately before coming to the Maine Medical Association as general counsel in 1981. He is a past chairman of the American Society of Medical Association Council and the AMA State Medical Society Litigation Center. Mr. Smith has also served as chair of the Maine Health Data Organization and of the Executive Committee of the Advocacy Resource Center of the American Medical Association. He is also a former chair of the Board of Quality Counts, a regional quality improvement collaborative, and a former board member of the Maine Association of Area Agencies on Aging. He is a current board member of the Daniel Hanley Center for Health Leadership. In 2016, he was named by Maine Magazine as one of the 50 Mainers influencing public policy and events in the state. In 2015, Mr. Smith received the President's Award from the Maine Public Health Association for exemplary service and commitment to the practice and profession of public health in the state of Maine. In 2016, he received the President's Award from the Maine Primary Care Association for dedication to improving the quality, accessibility, and value of healthcare in Maine. A frequent lecturer to medical groups on various medical legal subjects, Mr. Smith has served as Executive Vice President of the Maine Medical Association since September 1993 and has had a relationship with the association dating back to September 1979. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give controls over to our presenter for today. And you will see their screen shortly.
Okay, all set? Aaron, from your standpoint? Thank you. And good afternoon. Thank you for the nearly 100 participants that we expect today. I have with me in the office Andy McLean, our general counsel, and I may draw upon Andy's expertise from time to time if we have, as you have questions. I'm going to be going through the slides, but we have about an hour and a half, and then we want to save time for questions. We'll save I'm going to stop about halfway through and have Aaron check on any questions at that point, and then but we'll take most of the questions near the end. You can put your questions in the chat room. I want to remind you that you can also always email questions to us here at the association. My email address is on the last slide, so that if there's a few of you that are on the phone that aren't with us online at GoToMeeting, so you don't have access to the chat room, just send us an email at gsmith@mainemed.com and we'll get back to you privately. So before I get very far along on these slides, I do want to acknowledge the support of the Department of Health and Human Services as we make these presentations, particularly relevant to the law that passed, Chapter 488, which Aaron did say it was recent. It's actually now 2 1/3 years ago, July 1st of 2016, when it took effect. but I want to make some preliminary comments that aren't on the slides. While the slides are up to date, there are things that happen virtually every day in the opioid crisis world that are worth noting. Among the things today of interest are that there was an announcement that the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary Azar, will renew the public health emergency for the opioid crisis. That's the fourth time that the declaration has been renewed, comes roughly 1 year after the president had made his initial declaration. That declaration gives HHS the authority to quickly make resources available to help states respond to the crisis. And I believe that tomorrow, President Trump's going to actually sign the very significant opioid legislation that was passed by the House and Senate, and then those versions were reconciled, and the bill put on the president's desk, and I believe he's going to sign it tomorrow. So there's also an interesting article in the Bangor Daily News today about how Maine has spent its money under the 21st Century Cures Act, and there's been quite a bit of publicity about how the states that expanded Medicaid spent their money versus the states that did not, and we obviously have not yet accomplished that. So there's a lot going on, and while it is still a crisis, over time the issues have changed somewhat, and it's important to view it in the context of a long history of substance use disorders in this country and in this state. So we gave our first talk on the problem of OxyContin coming into Washington and Aroostook County in 2002. That's about right if you read some of the books that have been written, like Dreamland and Dope Sick and Painkillers. The availability of that medication in the state just about 2000, 2001, 2002 was becoming an issue, particularly in our rural areas. So while there's a lot that's been done in the last 2 years, the fact is that this problem has been with us a long time, at least 15, 16, 18 years. In fact, there's a recent paper in Science, in the Journal of Science, that outlined how the U.S. drug overdose epidemic has been inexorably tracking along on an exponential growth curve since at least 1979. And they describe in that article an epidemic that's really made up of several semi-epidemics. So this is one piece of it, but there's a lot of context to it as well. I want to acknowledge too that many of you have taken a look at the categories of attendees today, and many of you are prescribers, but many of you are also counselors, social workers. So many of you are on lines of this issue. We're just lawyers here. We don't have patients. We advocate. We work with the legislature as they pass laws, and we educate people about those laws and rules accompanying those laws. But we can learn a lot more from you who are actually doing this important work on the ground than you can learn from us. So please don't hesitate during the question and answer period to make comments. If you think I've said anything that's not what you're seeing on the ground, we're always happy to hear that. We've given over 100 of these talks over the past 2 years, and every talk I'm always surprised to learn something new that I had not been aware of before. So thank you for what you do to treat patients and to help the state and the patients in this considerable area. This first slide that I have up now we like to talk about because of the significance of the danger associated with opioid medication. And what the slide says essentially is that if you have a patient that's getting 200 milligrams of opiate medication a day, that they have a 1 in 32 chance of dying within 2.5 years of taking that first medication. So that's a high mortality rate for prescribers to talk to their patients about. It's clearly a risk. And while the 200 milligrams morphine equivalent is twice what our legal limit is under Chapter 488, the fact is we found patients at the time that the law was enacted, we found patients at 2,000 milligrams a day, and we found a patient at 4,000 milligrams morphine equivalent a day. So if your chance of dying is 1 in 32 at 200, imagine what your chance of dying are at 2,000 or at anything between, say, 2,000 and 4,000. So it's always something that we need to be aware of, is how dangerous this medication is. So we have permission from these families to share these photos of 3 of our young people in Maine who died of an overdose. We still have a high rate. There is, we'll talk about the federal statistics, the national statistics in a minute, but we have about the 8th highest rate of overdose per population, 417 overdoses last year. Some of those are, of course, suicides, but again, relatively few in the work that Marcy Sword did for the Attorney General's office. In the first 6 months of this year, for instance, 8% of the cases were determined to be suicides and not accidental deaths. So there's always a story behind the statistics. For your interest, the average age is still about 41, but there are overdoses among teenagers and among people 60 and 70 years old as well. And in Maine, the ratio is about 2 to 1 males more than females. That in the first 6 months of this year, that I think 71% of the deaths were male of all the drug deaths. Again, it's tragic. The numbers in 2018 seem to be tracking about the same as 2017. What's interesting to think about with respect to the overdose deaths is that Rhode Island and Vermont and Massachusetts all were able to achieve a decrease in the first 6 months of 2018. In fact, in decreases in 2017 over 2016 as well. And it's due to a number of factors, but all those states have expanded Medicaid. They've all put together significant treatment options. In Vermont, they have their noted hub and spoke model. And in Rhode Island, they've made treatment available among the incarcerated population, and that's had a significant impact in driving down their overdose deaths. So it takes leadership, it takes initiative, but some states are going in the right direction. We've not seen that, fortunately, in terms of the decrease in the overdose deaths, although we have seen significant decrease in opioid prescribing. This is just a graph comparing our overdose rates from drug use to our traffic deaths and homicides. So there's only 20 homicides in the state a year. Unfortunately, over half of those are related to domestic violence. But so compared to how many people we're losing by virtue of substance use disorders, 408. That number was adjusted to 417 in the most recent data. It's still a huge number. In addition to overdose deaths, because the legislature is greatly affected by the data regarding drug-impacted babies. And so we had, in 2016, we had over 1,000. 2017, there was a bit of a reduction to, I think, 952, as I recall. But that's still one out of, still, 1 out of 12 or so babies born in the state. So if we have anything like 1,000 babies born of mothers who have substance use disorders, active substance use disorders, that's actually, we only have 13,000 births in the state. So it's about 8% of our births, which is tragic. And it was good to see that come down a little bit in 2017, but it's still more than 3 babies a day on average. So by the numbers, you can see how those numbers have changed on this graph on the right of your slides. And you can see a little dip from 1,024 in 2016 to 952 in 2017. We don't have the data on 2018, even the first 6 months of data, but let's hope that those continue to decline. So on the national level, the figures are truly horrific. That in 2017 now, and these figures get revised by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, quite regularly. But the latest data established that over 72,000 people died in this country as a result of substance use disorders leading to overdoses in 2017, and that was an increase of 9.5% from 2016. Nearly half of those are all fentanyl, and we'll talk about that. But 72,000 deaths, when you think about it, as a comparison, I like to compare it to the loss of life in the Vietnam War, where over the many years of that war, our nation lost 58,000 soldiers. And in 1 year, 12-month period, in 2017, we lost 72,000 people to overdose deaths. It's truly staggering. And again, I really enjoyed reading those quotes from the journal Science that talked about the fact that these overdose deaths have really exponentially increased ever since 1979. So, it's time that people paid attention to it. And you're seeing that in the election in 2 weeks, and we can talk about that. So again, 200 overdose deaths every day, 1 every 8 minutes in the country. And over 630,000 people over the last 16 years. There's no question in my mind that within 3 or 4 years, they'll be sharing statistics that show that 1 million people have died of an overdose. And it is the leading cause of death under individuals under the age of 50. Another telling statistic, of course, is that in my lifetime, my life expectancy increased every single year that I was alive until 2017. And at that time, for Americans my age, male, we for the first time had a decrease in our life expectancy. And it was largely attributable to premature deaths of in this case, white males from overdose. I want to share a couple of slides that really came from a presentation at Maine Health that Katie Fulham Harris and Jerry Robinson did. We don't often talk about the cost of untreated addiction because the human toll is really so horrific that, you know, the cost is secondary, but it is not insignificant. And, you know, not being a clinician, I don't know all of the implications of drug use on the medical side, but obviously you've got hepatitis C, and but you have serious other things like endocarditis. And at any one day at the Maine Medical Center, there are 8 to 12 patients being treated for conditions related to substance use disorders. And the average cost of those inpatient stays is $500,000. And at least 40% of those patients are uninsured. And it is a significant burden on our provider community from a financial standpoint. I again want to attribute this slide to Katie Fulham Harris at Maine Health. I found it interesting. My history and my knowledge of this subject really begins with the third from the last bullet point, when Purdue Pharma began manufacturing and marketing OxyContin in their Partners Against Pain campaign in 1996. By 2001, it was the best-selling pain medication in the country. So I'm very familiar with that aspect of the epidemic, and the next bullet regarding the push by the accreditation agencies and the government to pay more attention to pain. But I was unfamiliar with the first half a dozen bullet points that really take us from opium poppies to heroin when it was actually marketed and used commercially. And it's a very interesting history. So how did we get here? Well, we've alluded to some of these causative factors as we've gotten to this point in the slide, that with the urging of the accreditation agencies to pay more attention to undertreatment of pain, along with the extended release opiates coming on the market in the mid-90s, it really very quickly led to a serious problem in small cities and large towns and in rural areas. There was a lot of overprescribing, and there was just a lot of illegal activity as well. And again, we saw that very early on in Aroostook County and in Washington County, but eventually every county suffered as a great deal. There are significant problems in Piscataquis County, in Oxford County, and yet most of the overdose deaths, because they're in York and Cumberland County. So it's a very serious problem, and it's well known how it started, and it's not abundantly clear how we're going to get out of it, although there's a lot of people working on it. So the evidence of overprescribing generally, I know at the recent public health conference that a local oral surgeon, Rob Berube, gave updated figures on this wisdom teeth issue, that with respect to wisdom teeth removal alone, it was, as recently as a couple of years ago, it was resulting in 42 million pills on the street in this country, because every patient and these are our adolescent patients, was receiving about 20 opioid pills and using only 8. And there's 10 million, there's 3.5 million surgeries. just for wisdom teeth. In general surgery, there's a lot of good work being done now, and a lot of education being done, and a lot of surgical departments and a lot of surgeons have found that they can decrease their prescribing post-surgically of opioids by a half to 3/4 without any adverse impact on the patients. There's a good news story in these slides. It's really in the progress that's being made to decrease the amount of opioid medication that's being prescribed, particularly for chronic pain. Prescribing of opioid medication has declined, has been on decline since 2011, and the number of high-dose prescriptions, more than 90 MME, fell 41.4% from 2010 to 2015. We had one of the largest drops in the country after the passage, well, from 2013 to 2017, which encompassed the period of time in which the law, Chapter 488, was passed. But a lot of that was done before Chapter 488. So we've decreased prescribing of opioids in this state by at least a third. And again, in that 13, 14, 15, 16, in that 5-year period, we had the 5th largest drop in the country. And in 2017 alone, we saw a decline of 13.2%. And that was actually based upon dosage. That was the largest decline in the country. So while Chapter 488 and the rules accompanying it and the educational efforts that went along with it certainly have a lot, were one of the reasons, probably the most significant reason for these declines. It's obviously not the only reason. And I say that because half the states in the country haven't passed anything with respect to limiting opioid prescribing, and every state in the country saw a decline in prescribing. So ours was probably steeper and needed to be, because I haven't shown you the slide, and it may not be in the slide deck, that showed that based upon CDC data in 2012, Maine unfortunately had the, on a per capita basis, was the #1 prescribing state of long extended release opiates. That really is the extended release OxyContin, the drugs that are most abused. And in a CDC study based on 2012 data, we were #1. We're not #1 in many things. We're not #1 anymore in college hockey. We're not #1 in SAT scores, but we're #1 in, we were at that time, #1 in the prescribing of extended release opioid. And that's simply not a good thing. As a lawyer, I can reach only one of two conclusions. Either people in Maine have a lot more pain than any place else on earth, or there's a lot of overprescribing that was going on. And I think the fact that we've declined, that prescribing has decreased by a third, is further evidence that a lot of that was the latter. So here is a graphical depiction of how many scripts fewer that we're writing per year. Here's another illustration compared to Maine, New England, and the U.S. average. Again, our drop was greater, but we had further to come based upon that 2012 data. I want to acknowledge, before talking a little bit about the Maine Opiate Collaborative and the legislative task force, that many of you who treat patients are well aware that there is another side to the story as well. When Chapter 488 went into effect, that the first thing that took effect in July 1st of 2016 was the daily limit. Not many states have imposed a hard daily limit. Ours is at 100 milligrams morphine equivalent, which seems generous under the CDC guidelines. But we also knew, the legislature became aware through PMP data, prescription monitoring program data, that exceeded that limit. Now, there are exceptions in the law, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but, you know, the obvious ones: end-of-life care, hospice care, palliative care, cancer, and also opioids for the impact that cancer may have had as a result of the treatment of cancer. Those are all exceptions. And so we don't know right now how many of those 13,000 patients are still over the limit and have found exceptions. At some point, that data ought to be available from the PMP because it's something that's obviously important to know. But we do know that not every single patient was an appropriate candidate to be tapered to a safer dose. That some patients, probably, you know, a few, clinically should have been left right where they were, and maybe they have been. But we do get a lot of calls here at the association. We had one yesterday from patients who cannot, who on a self-diagnosed basis at least, believe that they are now not getting adequate pain relief, and that some of them are suicidal, some of them are just in pain and are really suffering. And so frankly, when our members here at the Maine Medical Association, you know, occasionally complain about what a pain in the neck the law has been in terms of the PMP checks and electronic prescribing and the other regulatory requirements of the law, I remind them that the people that have really been adversely affected are some of the patients. You know, how many? That would be very subjective to determine. I do, in our talks like this around the state, like to quote one of our best resources of state, Steve Hull, a physiatrist at Mercy Hospital, who worked with us on the law, worked with the legislature, and it was Steve's view that of these 13,000 patients, that 90% of them could be tapered safely to a safer dose or off of opioids entirely. And we certainly have some patients now who have done well and frequently a part of our talks. And there are success stories. But there are also some patients who can't find a prescriber to work with them by using the palliative care exception or any other exception, and who are really struggling and continue to struggle. So I always want to acknowledge that as we that there is another side to that coin. The Maine Opiate Collaborative actually started in August of 2015 when President Obama's Director of National Drug Control Policy at the White House, Michael Botticelli, was brought up to Bangor, Brewer more specifically, in a meeting hosted at Eastern Maine, by Eastern Maine Health Systems, now Northern Light. And there were about 75 people invited to participate in that forum and summit, if you will. And Senator King brought Botticelli to Maine, and but Tom Delahanty, the U.S. Attorney, was there. Shelley Pingree was there. We had families there who had lost a child to an overdose, and it was a really, I think, an important occasion. I was really pleased to be asked by Angus to moderate that session, and over a couple hours, everybody had an opportunity to make a comment that wanted to, and at the front of the room, as I say, was the U.S. Attorney, United States Senator, United States Congresswoman, and the nation's drug czar at that time, Botticelli. And out of that summit, and the summit the next day that the governor had of law enforcement, and there were only about 4 people that attended both of those summits, grew the Maine Opiate Collaborative. And the collaborative was really chaired by Janet Mills, Tom Delahanty, and John Morris, Governor LePage's Commissioner of Public Safety. And the 3 of them worked quite collaboratively for well over a year to oversee the appointment and work of 3 task forces, one on treatment, one on prevention and harm reduction, and one on law enforcement. And here at the Maine Medical Association, we pretty much staffed the treatment and the prevention and harm reduction task forces. We did not meet with the law enforcement task force. They had, not surprisingly, some issues that needed to be dealt with confidentially, and they met out at the Commissioner of out at the Office of the Public Safety. But out of that came many recommendations, and those recommendations made their way to the legislature, some of them, and some of them passed. Again, I think if you look at those recommendations, and recently a progress report was done through paid for from a grant by the Maine Health Access Foundation that went to every legislative candidate, revealing, so to speak, how much progress has been made in each of the recommendations. And there has been progress, no doubt, made, particularly in the area of prescribing, but less progress in treatment, some progress in law enforcement, and in my opinion, almost very little progress in prevention. A second, the collaborative, while the recommendations live on, and the collaborative really no longer really exists. There's a new U.S. Attorney, Halsey Frank, and there may be a new Attorney General, and there'll probably be a new Commissioner of Public Safety. So we're about to embark on these initiatives with a new group of people. But the legislature, early in 2017, also organized a task force to address the opioid crisis in the state. And that was chaired by Senator Andre Cushing and Representative Jay McCrate. Jay is a social worker by training, and I also had an opportunity with a group of physicians to serve on that task force. And there may be others on that task force that actually are on this call. And other recommendations were made, but the first thing the task force did was really look at the recommendations of the collaborative. And so now I think that the feeling around the state, because there were 40 or 50 volunteers involved with the collaborative, is that we don't need a lot of task forces. We don't need a lot more study, that the recommendations are sound. What we need are the resources and the political will to do some of the things that are recommended in these recommendations. That's why there's a lot of people that were very interested in getting that into the hands of all the candidates for the legislature and the 4 candidates running for governor. I don't know whether we've been going for about a half hour. Is this a reasonable time to ask for any questions, Aaron? I think I'll stop there just before going into the law itself, and just see if there's any questions at this point. I don't have access to the chat box right now. Are there any questions that you are aware of?
I do not see any questions in the chat box.
Okay, we're going to plow on then. And Chapter 488, as I say, we're going to go through this pretty quickly because most of you over the 2 years and 4 months that we've had the law are familiar with it. But the law was very significant. It's probably the most comprehensive law limiting prescribing of opioids in the country. There are 20 to 25 states that have done some similar things, but nobody's done all 5 things in the neat little package that the Maine legislature did. And I give the governor a lot of credit for bringing in the original draft. Then it was negotiated by a group of us in terms of exceptions and effective dates. And most everyone then supported the law. It took effect, as I say, the first piece. I'll go through the 5 pieces very quickly, but the first, and I'll do them in the order chronologically that they took effect. So the prescribing limits per day was the first piece that took effect on July 1st of 2016. There was some transition periods of time. People could be left on higher limits in some extent till the end of the year. There was some transition provisions. And again, I wish we had better data right now to tell you how many people in Maine still exceed the limit, but I do not have that information. But that was clearly, in my opinion, the most impactful piece of the legislation. Also that day, patients for the first time could request a partial fill of their prescription. Until that time, it was really up to the discretion of the pharmacist. So now, if your doctor gives you a 3-day supply in a prescription, and you go to the pharmacy to have it filled, you say, look, I've got teenagers at home, I do not want this stuff around. I had my other hip done 3 years ago, and I only took 3 of the pills. I'm only willing to pay and to take home 6 days of this and not 30. Under the new law, the pharmacist has to honor that request, has to notify within 7 days, as I recall, the prescriber so that they'll know what was dispensed. And this should have some, as it's better known out there with patients, it should have a positive impact upon fewer pills being available for diversion. The next thing that took effect on January 1st of 2017 was the mandatory prescription monitoring program check for opioids by the pharmacist as well as the prescriber, and that applies also to benzodiazepines. So the mandatory PMP check, as it applies to benzodiazepines, that's the only piece of this law that affects more than opioid medication. So our law is not aimed at all controlled substances. It really is very focused on just opioids. The fourth piece of the law limiting scripts, the duration of scripts, to 7 days for acute pain and 30 days for chronic pain, also took effect on January 1st, 2017. Those scripts can be renewed. It was important, they can't be refilled by phone, but they can be renewed. And that was a very important thing for the patients to understand, because if they read an article in the Bangor Daily News that says, acute scripts or chronic scripts are limited to 7 days, 30 days, a reasonable person might read that and fear that that's all you get, period. And that's not the case. It is intentionally creating a hassle, if you will, an administrative burden to so that there's an incentive to write for shorter duration and to have to go to the burden of writing a new script if it's going to be renewed. Most states have now some limit on the length of such scripts. Before talking about the exceptions to most of these provisions, I'll just talk about the other 2 parts of the law. One is the mandatory continuing medical education. It's 3 hours for people who prescribe every 2 years. They had to have that done by the end of 2017. And now, in one case at the Board of Medicine, at least, even licensees who don't prescribe have to have that 3-hour education by the end of 2018. And then that CME also has to be renewed. It has to be done every 2 years under which was done at a 2-year interval, because that's when the licensing interval happens. And then there was mandatory electronic prescribing. That was the last thing that took effect. I may have to really pull out, do this from memory. I think that electronic prescribing began around August 1st of 2017. I stand to be corrected if that's not precise. But the state grant was able to, you had the ability to apply for a waiver of the provision. And that was liberally granted by the state. Quite a few different organizations were able to get a waiver for at least a year, and they built systems so they could electronically prescribe. At the time that the law passed, like 1 or 2% of scripts were being for opioids were being done electronically, and now it's way up to probably in the area of 90%. New York's is like 98%. New York was the only other state that 2 years before Maine required electronic prescribing. So it's mostly a software issue. There's expense involved, of course, but most people believe that by keeping that paper script out of the hands of the patient, that it will also serve the mission of preventing diversion. It does have some downside, of course, not just the expense and the training, but also, if I get a paper script from my physician, and walk out the door with it, I have complete freedom of choice where I choose to have that filled. If it's being done electronically from the physician's, from the prescriber's office, it's only going to be really dispensed at one location. Now, again, I get to determine as the patient where that one location is, but it doesn't give me any chance to shop around once I know the price or for any other reason. So these are the things that took effect. Let's talk about the major exceptions in the law. It's important to understand that Chapter 488 is primarily aimed at limiting opioid prescribing on an outpatient ambulatory basis. It really doesn't have much impact on the inpatient hospital or the inpatient long-term care facilities. It's really, we've been able to limit its impact in cases where patients are directly dispensed by an MA or a CNA the medication, where they're not handling the medication, not handling a script. Generally, this law doesn't apply. So, and it doesn't apply to, as I mentioned earlier, cancer treatment, patients that have cancer, or the aftercare associated, and there's no time limit on that. The regulatory people tried to put a year limit on that, but that was not consistent with the law, and they ultimately withdrew that. So it is certainly true that several years after cancer has gone into remission, patients can still be suffering from the effects of the chemotherapy and the radiation and the surgery. And so that's a major exception. There's also an exception for end-of-life care and hospice care. There's special rules for pregnancy, for patients that need an acute script and are already on a chronic opioid, and there's the famous palliative care exception. We'll discuss that in a moment. I mentioned earlier that 13,000 Mainers exceeded the limit when the law took effect, and we simply don't know now how many have found an exception. So palliative care, many of you clinicians are aware that palliative care is not the same as hospice care, and that palliative care is all of the things that are described in this slide. It's patient-centered, family-focused medical care that optimizes quality of life by preventing, and treating suffering caused by serious illness or physical injury or condition that substantially affects quality of life. And it addresses a number of physical, emotional, social, spiritual needs, facilitates patient autonomy. You have goals for treatment and treatment options, and it serves to manage your pain and comprehensively. Even though it doesn't require a terminal illness, many clinicians believe that it did, and associated, perhaps in their medical training, they associated palliative care with end-of-life care. And so when the law first took effect, many patients reported that while they believed that they were entitled to the palliative care exception, that their prescribers not think they qualify. So in 2017, through the efforts of the House Chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, Patty Hymanson, who is a retired neurologist, there was real interest in sending a message to the clinical community that said, look, palliative care was put in this law for a reason. It does not require a terminal illness. It does require a serious illness. It's palliative. The exception is not just for palliative care, but it's for palliative care in conjunction with a serious illness. And so there was an amendment made in 2017 that said that made clear that palliative care does not always include a requirement for hospice care or attention to spiritual needs. That was to send the message that you don't have to be terminally ill. And then the legislature also amended the serious illness part of the law to give as an example chronic, unremitting, or intractable pain, such as neuropathic pain. This amendment was sufficiently robust to actually avoid a lawsuit that was being prepared on behalf of a number of patients who were over the limit, who believed that limiting their right to pain medication was a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But once the palliative care exception was amended, enough of those patients found physicians to work with them that that lawsuit was never brought. It would have been interesting, as an attorney, I would have found it interesting, see how that would be resolved. But I also think it's to everybody's benefit that this was worked out in enough cases that the lawsuit was never brought. The prescriber responsibilities, again, these are things that I've already talked about. You've got the required PMP check. It's not only upon the initial prescription, but also every 90 days. And I'm going to go through these things very quickly now because I want to get to the Chapter 21 rules of the licensing boards. You can delegate that PMP check to a staff member as long as they're you sign up and then be your delegate. But even if you delegate it to a medical assistant or someone else in your office, the prescriber themselves has to review at least the aggregate morphine equivalent milligram, the dose, so to speak, the number of prescribers currently prescribing to the individual, and the number of pharmacies currently dispensing. There are some exceptions to the PMP check. It's not required for benzodiazepine or opioid medication directly administered in an emergency room setting, an inpatient hospital setting, or long-term care facility, or in conjunction with a surgical procedure. That's so that we don't have to worry about the amount of anesthesia that's given that might, in fact, exceed the limit. Now, you don't want to read this in connection with a surgical procedure too broadly, because that as soon as that surgeon writes a script for your post-op care that's going to be filled by you at a pharmacy outside the hospital, then the law certainly applies to that script. It simply doesn't apply to things that are done in the inpatient hospital setting. There also is no PMP check required for hospice or end-of-life patients. So the required notations on the opioid prescriptions, you have to write acute or chronic, and you have to write, the exemptions are all labeled in a rule from A to H, and I actually think that those are listed on the slide here coming up. And palliative care exception, which is exemption code B, the diagnosis code, the ICD-10 code has to be included. We hope that someday a researcher will go into be allowed to go into the PMP database under appropriate IRB approvals to look at what all the palliative care exceptions and see what the diagnosis is. So it would be very important as a policy matter in the state for the legislature and the regulators to know what types of conditions and illnesses are being used by prescribers for the palliative care exemption. Originally, it was the position of the state that a pharmacist, that if your script was missing, the code or some other piece of information, that the pharmacist couldn't just pick up the phone and call you. But because of advocacy on our part and many other people, it's now clear that pharmacists can, in fact, contact the prescriber by telephone to verify and document the missing information on the script. That's certainly the best thing from the patient's standpoint. So the exceptions are, we've been through them. A is the cancer, B is palliative care, C is end-of-life care, D is medication-assisted treatment. Again, you'll remember what I said 10 minutes ago, that this law primarily limits prescribing of opiates for pain. It was not intended to limit the prescribing of opioids for medication-assisted treatment. So Suboxone, for instance, that's something that we would consider good, that people are getting treatment for their illness, and that can be filled as long as you put code D on the script. Continuing with the exemptions, pregnancies covered by code E, acute pain over existing opioid, and now we've got a patient that's already in chronic pain, but now they fall and break their leg. They're going to need probably more than our limit permits, and you can do that by using code F. If you're actively tapering the patient, you can do that for 6 months and exceed the limit. That's code G. And then prescribing a second opioid if the patient's intolerant to the first, that's code H. We've talked about CME. We've talked about electronic prescribing. We've talked about electronic prescribing. These are the exceptions. It's good there's an exception not only if you lose your power, but also if your system goes down. So that's quite a broad interpretation. And then you can see on this last bullet point, if a prescriber reasonably determines it would be impractical and that the patient could not obtain medication on a time basis and delay would adversely impact the patient's medical condition, that in fact a paper script can be filled by the pharmacist. So really, we've had very few complaints, frankly, about the e-prescribing mandate since it took effect. Penalties, everybody, when we do these programs, seems to want to talk about the penalties. I don't know that anyone's been fined for violating the law. I don't think there'll be such there is a person really intentionally violates the law or egregiously violates the law because they didn't know what the law was. Of more concern is a provision that the PMP staff will report violations to the Board of Medicine or to the licensing board involved with that prescriber, but they won't report it without giving the provider 2 weeks notice and an opportunity to comment. I don't know how many reports have been sent by the PMP to the licensing board. I would guess at this point relatively few, if any. So in addition to the Department of Health and Human Services doing a rule that ultimately was utilized to implement the law, including the establishment of the code rule that at that time was Chapter 11. And Chapter 11 had begun with guidelines for the prescribing of pain, and the first iteration of those rules was in 1999. So we got almost a 20-year history with at least the Board of Medicine, the Board of Osteopathic Licensure. So they needed to go, that rule that had the guidelines for treatment of pain was amended around 2010, and in that amendment, the boards were joined by the nursing board, because obviously nurse practitioners, and they were joined by the podiatric medical board and by the dental board, so that all the 5 boards that deal with prescribers did a joint rule. This was really impressive. Under the Administrative Procedures Act, it's actually quite a process to get one board to do one rule. To get 5 boards to meet, negotiate, and issue one rule, which they all have to do together. Well, they have to do them, they got to come up with the same rule, and then they each have to go through their own processes with the Administrative Procedures Act to make them effective for that board. And these 5 boards did that. Now, once Chapter 488 was enacted in 2016, the boards had to go back and amend that law to be consistent with Chapter 488. 3 of the boards have done that. The podiatric board and the dental board have not joined on to the new rule. They will have to eventually amend their own rules or join on to this one, because right now their rules are inconsistent with Chapter 488. If all that this joint rule, Chapter 21, did, which took effect in March, by the way, at the medical board, and now is in effect at all 3 of the boards, medicine, osteopathy, and the nursing board. If all they had done was to, in fact, conform Chapter 11 to Chapter 488, I wouldn't even have them in these slides. But they did much more than that. And to some extent, this was reasonable because the types of things in the Chapter 11 tended to be different than the things that the Chapter 488 dealt with. So, you know now what 488 dealt with: the duration of scripts, the limits on the daily dose, electronic prescribing, and mandatory PMP checks. The board rules dealt more with things like treatment agreements, urine drug screens, risk assessments, and the like, random pill counts, etc. That were really more directed towards diversion. So the new rule, and when we go out and do our presentations, we usually take a copy with us, because it's really important that clinicians have an understanding of it. You can go to any of the board's websites and check. You can go to any of the board's websites and download a copy of the rule. So the new rule, the amended rule, it defines the terms, some terms. It requires that clinicians achieve and maintain competence in assessing pain and treating pain. Requires that clinicians consider use of non-pharmacologic modalities and non-controlled drugs in treatment of pain prior to prescribing controlled substances. And it requires the use and documentation of universal precautions when prescribing controlled substances. So, in a way, what this rule does is really bring their Chapter 11 into more the modern practice and current standards of practice, now that medicine knows what it knows about the significant issues that have brought about the epidemic that we're in. I'll talk about universal precautions when I come to a different slide, because I do think that that's perhaps the most problematical of these provisions. So the universal precautions involves evaluating the patient, including doing a risk assessment, developing a treatment plan, but that's only for chronic pain. If you prescribe and expect the script to be renewed beyond 90 days, then that would be chronic. Periodic review of the treatment efficacy, obtaining written informed consent, that's chronic only. Toxicologic drug screens, that's chronic. Random pill counts, those aren't mandated but are sometimes appropriate. Reporting of illegal acts are encouraged but not mandated. And there's a required compliance with state and federal Controlled Substances Act. That's of no consequence. You'd be obligated to do that as well. And then it talks about the CME requirements. So with respect to the evaluation of the patient, and to go back to the concept of universal precautions, most of you are familiar with the term universal precautions because we use that term. That term was really coined in conjunction with HIV and AIDS back in the 80s. And why did we do that? Well, that was done in order to ensure that the protection of the treatment team and recognize, and it was also done to avoid discriminating against those patient populations that were most at risk of being HIV positive. The gay population, IV drug users, and also people hemophiliac, who had, and other people who had a blood transfusion. So recognizing that those patients were not always readily identifiable, that it was unfair to discriminate on the basis of these characteristics, it was determined by the regulators that we would treat every patient as if they were HIV positive, and that was the best way to ensure the protection of our team and to ensure that those categories that I named were not discriminated against. So in the 90s, it apparently became important. Well, in the 90s, there's a group of clinicians rather, that began referencing the term universal precautions in reference to opioid treatment and opioid use disorders. And now it's really got some traction to the point where, at least in Maine, these licensing boards have adopted it. And so now this regulation is law. And what it really means is that it's taking away your discretion as a clinician to determine who's at high risk and who's at low risk. And with respect to some types of activity, some types of action, such as the risk assessment. So it doesn't matter that this patient's 95 years old, that you've treated them for 40 years, that they live across the street from you, and that you don't think that you need to do urine drug screen on them on a regular basis simply because they're on a very, very low dose of an opioid for management of their osteoarthritis. This rule now says you will do that urine drug screen on them at least once a year. And so it's what the Maine Medical Association doesn't like about the law, because it again has taken away your discretion with respect to who needs some of these things and who doesn't. But it is the law. So again, in terms of evaluating the patient, there's a medical history, an HMP, of course, that you take before prescribing any controlled substance for acute or chronic pain. And there's an initial medical history and physical evaluation of the patient that has to be documented in the chart, and it has to include all these things A through I. And I don't know whether those of you who are prescribers, whether you would be doing all these 8 or 9 things or not. But I call them to your attention, and now you will need to, even for the acute script. Risk assessment before prescribing or increasing the dose of any controlled substance to a patient for acute or chronic, clinician has to perform a risk assessment. So that risk assessment is meant to determine whether the potential benefits of prescribing controlled substances outweigh the risk, and includes factors involved in the patient's overall level of risk of developing adverse effects, abuse, addiction, or overdose. For acute pain, a basic consideration of short-term risk shall be assessed. So even in the emergency room, then it needs, if the person's going to walk out there with 3 days of thing until they can see a surgeon on Monday, there's going to have to be some modified risk assessment. This might be justifiable on the grounds that in the past, in many times, there wasn't sufficient attention paid to the risk that that particular patient had. Family, addiction within the family, adverse childhood events, etc. And even in the acute situation, I might not have this statistic absolutely down pat, so I apologize but I'm going to make the point anyway, that for patients who are given, for acute pain, who are given an opioid medication for 10 days, for 10 days, that like 20% of those patients are still on opioids a year later. That's stunning to me, but that's close to the number. So that even when we think, oh, well, I'm just going to give Johnny, a 10-day script here for him to get over this particular acute problem, in some patients with high risk, it only takes a few days. And then the next 10 years is just a blur. So again, we're going to have to do a better job at risk assessment and documenting those risks. Now, we don't have to guess what we're supposed to do for the risk assessment, because the boards have said that they encourage an appropriate risk screening tool, and there's many, as you clinicians know, there's many that are available online. And you have to consider the following factors as part of the risk assessment. Obviously, the family history of physical or sexual abuse, current use of substances, including tobacco, and psychiatric conditions. If this is all there was associated with the risk assessment, again, I might not get all that wound up about it, but it goes on to 9 other things. Regular use of benzos, alcohol, other central nervous system medications, receipt of opioids from more than one prescriber, aberrant behavior, evidence of significant adverse events, including falls, fractures, sleep apnea, or other respiratory risk factors, comorbidities, possible pregnancy. Now, again, I'm not a clinician. It may be that in doing a risk assessment for any opioid, you would do all these things and record it. But we do know that there are instances, because we sit at the medical board meetings now and see the people respond to complaints, and there's fewer and fewer egregious cases, in my opinion. But in the past, we have seen cases where a physician has written over a weekend a script for pain medication for a patient that they've never physically examined, or did it for a friend and had no medical record of it. Now, again, I think most everybody knows better now, but again, it's not a surprise that the boards are now, putting in a rule exactly what needs to be done. Now, in additional provisions in the rule, you have to reassess inherited patients, meaning that in lots of my talks and our talks, we'll talk to patients, we'll talk to prescribers after the program, and frequently the conversation goes something like this: Mr. Smith, I just got to this practice 3 months ago, and a physician had left, and I've inherited his panel of patients, and I am appalled at the level of prescribing of opioids. And what am I supposed to do? Well, this helps you to have that conversation with the patients, because as soon as you renew those scripts, they're your script. And you need to at least be able to document that you have talked with the patient about tapering, that you're going to reassess their treatment plan and try to get them to a safer level of prescribing. So inherited patients, in other words, are not going to be, you're not going to be excused for just continuing high doses of opioids on patients that you inherited from another doctor or other prescriber. You're going to do the lowest dose possible. You're going to prescribe immediate release opioids instead of extended release. When prescribing for chronic pain initially, you're going to consider it a therapeutic trial for a defined period of time for no more than 30 days. And there will be a frequency. You'll determine, you will review treatment efficacy on a periodic basis depending upon the patient's risk factors and the medication dose. Obviously, if it's a high dose and you've got them under a palliative care exception, for instance, you're going to review that treatment more frequently than if they're on a very, very low dose. And you're going to do toxicology drug screens at least annually for chronic patients. So I want to go back and deal with one. You really, if you have a lot of patients on opioids, you definitely need to get a copy of Chapter 21 and read through it and make sure that you understand it. And if you have any questions about it, you can call one of our attorneys here at the Maine Medical Association. One issue that came up very quickly with respect to the risk assessment was whether it applied only to new patients or to a patient that you increase the dose of an opioid, of controlled substances, or whether it applied to even your existing patients. And if so, what would the board be asking for in that situation? And we've had to go to the board and talk about that, because when you look at this language right from the rule, and you look at that first sentence, it says, before prescribing or increasing the dose of any controlled substances to a person for acute or chronic pain, a clinician shall perform and document a risk assessment of the patient. Well, it doesn't say before the initial prescribing, which would, if it said before initially prescribing, then we wouldn't worry about patients that you'd already had under, it would be like the existing patients were grandfathered. And it doesn't say before prescribing or renewing, because obviously for the patients that otherwise would be grandfathered, you'd be renewing those scripts on an ongoing basis. It basically says before prescribing or increasing the dose. But we've talked with the lawyers for the board, and they believe that the intent of the board was to, in fact, apply this to all existing scripts and not consider, previous scripts and patients on previous scripts to be grandfathered. That's probably the right answer, even from a point of view of good medical practice. So again, it's going to take a little more work on the part of clinicians who have a lot of patients on opioid medication for pain, but it wouldn't be appropriate for the board to reissue this rule and simply turn the other way with respect to patients that may be on dangerously high doses and who are not getting, who never got an adequate risk assessment and who are not getting a review of their treatment plan or urine drug screens on any regular basis. So we're about to send out guidance on that from the association, because there are people that out there, I'm afraid, who actually believe that, oh, this just applies to new patients or an existing patient that I increase the dose of. But based upon the board's lawyers' advice, that wasn't, the intent is not limited to those patients. All right, I'm going to move on to another subject, which is basically that each payer that your patients may have coverage with may also have their own requirements. And Maine Care, for instance, under this existing policy, if you look at that last bullet, says prescribers must evaluate benefit and harms of continued opioid therapy with patients who have continued therapy beyond 3 months, at least once every 6 months during a face-to-face appointment or more frequently thereafter. So while there was no provision in Chapter 488 that says how frequently you have to see a patient, in this case, Maine Care is saying, well, we want you to see the patient at least every 6 months. And you may have similar requirements with respect to commercial insurers. And that's just one of the things that we're looking at in terms of how frequently you have to see the patient. So there may be other requirements for particular payers. That might determine when they're going to pay for a urine toxicology screen, for instance. And then finally, in addition to payer policies, you may have policies within the institution. If you're not practicing in a solo private practice, your institution, your employer, may well have requirements with respect to opioid prescribing that are more strict than Chapter 488 or the rules accompanying Chapter 488. And so we've learned the hard way as we've made these 100+ talks that people in the audience will say, well, gee, at my practice, the owner of the practice requires us to do ABC. And we say, well, that's the right that they have. If they believe that that's something that they culturally want to do within their practice, they certainly have the right to do that. So here's some resources we have available. At the Caring for Maine page at Maine Quality Counts, we have, in fact, recorded a number of these talks. And so if you have colleagues that need to get their 3 hours education, they can go online, and there's no cost to any of these courses at this point. There are some bells and whistles associated with it if you're going to get CME, but you might take a pre-test and then print out a certificate or something. But at least they're all available. You can do them in the middle of the night, and there's quite a few different modules available. There's also on our website a Maine Independent Clinical Information Service page that has a toolkit for prescribers, has some modules for naloxone administration, etc. And then we have our own opioid crisis page on the MMA website. This slide contains obviously our contact information. There's so many, I get so many patients calling who are struggling that it's like I have my own panel of patients. So I felt that, well, if all the patients have my cell phone number, the prescribers might as well have it as well. So it is definitely the best way to reach me if you need some interpretation of this law, or and then again, emails available to Andy, Peter, or myself as well. So that's pretty much is my presentation. I'd like to open it up for questions. We've got actually more time for questions than I thought we would have. So I hope you'll ask me some questions so that we can go into more depth on anything from, you know, what do we see coming down the road? What do we think the state needs to do to improve the situation? I'm sure that if you send me in the right direction, that I can make the next 30 minutes valuable for you. Is that all right, Aaron?
Yes, I do not see any questions in the chat box so far. I just want to remind participants that everyone will continue to be muted, and questions can be submitted via the chat box in GoToMeeting only. So at this moment in time, I do not have any questions from participants.
All right. Well, let me ask my own question and answer it then. I think it's clear from my introductory remarks that the place that the state finds itself in is as follows: that we started out with a high level of prescribing. We have done a tremendous amount of education. The legislature's, you know, has enacted a strong law that has helped reduce the amount of opioid medication that's diverted. On the other hand, we understand acutely that if there was never another opioid prescribed in the state, we'd still have people dying of overdoses. And you remember that data that I cited that just came out very, very recently, that of those 70,000 deaths in the country in 2017, now for the first time, over 10,000 were cocaine and meth. They weren't opioids. So we have a problem in this country and in this state with people abusing substances, of which the most abused is still alcohol. And many of you in the treatment field for substance use understand this way better than I do. But I think with respect to the whole issue of substance use disorders, that the landscape is changing. And it's been changing for some time. And of course, the fact that we've done a good job at tightening up the availability of prescription opioids, has resulted in fewer deaths associated strictly with prescription opioids. And that's clear from the report of the first 8 months of the first 6 months of the year that Marcy Sorg did for the Attorney General's office. Just reading from her report, basically, the high number of fatal overdoses in Maine continues to be driven by non-pharmaceutical fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. 61% of deaths whereas pharmaceutical opioids caused 26% of deaths. Compared to 2017 as a whole, the portion of the illicit non-pharmaceutical drug deaths has stayed the same, while the proportion of pharmaceutical drugs has decreased from 61% to 57%. So again, the 2018 deaths for these 6 months involving fentanyl and fentanyl analogs were less likely than in 2017 to involve other opioids or alcohol. So with respect to the deaths, overdose deaths, the story now is really fentanyl. That's not to say that we can relax in the medical community and say, well, we've taken care of our part, that we overprescribed for years. We were sold a bill of goods by the pharmaceutical industry, but now, and it's taken us 15 years to straighten it out, but now we've done our part and we can go on our merry way. Because people are still going to die. And even heroin, it's not a heroin issue so much anymore. It's really fentanyl. And this is so difficult for the law enforcement community because fentanyl comes from different places than heroin does and that prescription drugs do. It's largely manufactured in China and gets here in the mail or through Vancouver or other places. And so that really is now where some of the resources need to be directed to in terms of driving down our overdose numbers. Now, at the same time, we have the problem associated with let me say it this way. We've also now learned our lessons, I think, in medicine, and now we will avoid at almost all costs beginning patients on opioids for chronic pain. So we are now down at the legislature trying to get insurance coverage for things that 30 years ago we thought were not sound medical treatments and we're trying to eliminate. So now almost all of medicine, in my opinion, if you want to see an array of alternatives to opioids for pain, whether that's medicinal marijuana, acupuncture, cognitive behavioral therapy, yoga, massage, chiropractic, almost anything that avoids starting that patient down that track, because starting down that track, we've seen the horrific results. The problem, I think, now is, in addition to the future of the dangers of fentanyl, is the people who got started on opioids for chronic pain over the last 15 years, those that are still alive, and what we do for them. Sometimes it goes well, and you can taper them off of opioids and find something that works for them. But for many of them, they're really struggling, and some sociologists have dubbed this the lost generation. That and if you read Dreamland or Dope Sick by Beth Macy, you get that impression that unfortunately there's entire communities and families that have been so egregiously affected by this epidemic, and what we do for them has been quite limited, and we have a minimum number of tools to work with: Suboxone, methadone, Narcan, and people, of course, try to sometimes just use abstinence, but the data is very clear that that even with medication-assisted therapy, your odds of staying off of your drug of choice is probably about 50%, and then people are going to relapse. And we haven't had a chance today to talk about the problems associated with stigma. So we got a lot of work to do in the cultural area that, we all need to help our neighbors and friends and society to understand that substance use disorders are a chronic illness like diabetes, and that people deserve to be treated with respect and deserve a chance to get well, and will need a lot of support during their recovery and may well relapse, and that's not going to stop us from helping them again. I know there's now at least one question that's been asked. This was a nice opportunity for me to get on my soapbox a little bit, but let me open it up for questions.
Okay, so I have two questions that have come in. One from Patricia Salvatore. She says, I wonder about alternative pain control, such as lidocaine infusions. I know the infusions can be time-consuming, as well as needing a nurse to monitor the patient while the infusion is happening. Not sure about the cost and prevention costs in comparison to the reactive costs of prescribing opioids, related cost to overdoses and hospitalization, in parentheses, and cost of reacting.
Well, I don't know anything about lidocaine infusion. So if there are people on the call that can offer anything, I guess we can't unmute everybody, but again, I'm a lawyer. I can teach you the law, but that's not an alternative that I'm familiar with. I would go back to what I said before, that I think any alternative that reduces the risk of addiction, that effectively treats the person's pain, should be looked at very, very seriously. Expense should be secondary to functionality, in my opinion, because when you come right to it, even though this is how we got into the problem in the first place, is some of the pain medication is very inexpensive. Heroin's very inexpensive. But society's expense of dealing with the risks associated with it, once the person develops the disorder, the costs are unimaginable. Now the question?
Second question, and this is the last one that has come in up to this point. In the time that PMP has been collecting data, how many times have they made it available?
Well, I can only tell you from our own experience here at the Maine Medical Association. So there may be data coming from the PMP going somewhere that I don't know about, but we've not been very successful in getting regular reports from the PMP about things like how many people now still exceed the limit. Even the reports, the data that we used with respect to, you saw releases about, that our opioid prescribing had dropped by 1/3. That data came from IMS, the data aggregator that buys all the data from the pharmacies and then puts it together. And then there was the second piece about the dosages came from Avalier, a consulting company that also had gotten data from somewhere. So I'd be very interested in having the old advisory committee used to get together with the PMP staff, sit around the table. It had some clinicians, had some pharmacists, had some prescribers, some advocates, some patients, and we used to be able to talk about issues with the PMP, but that group has not met in several years.
Okay, that is all the questions that have been submitted.
Well, I think then, Aaron, I know that we're 15 minutes early, but I think we should wrap it up. We've certainly had a nice opportunity to present the law, the regulation, and kind of the context in which all this is being done in the state. And I very much appreciate and thank you and Scott and AdCare for giving us this opportunity to put the information out there, and again, encourage people to communicate with us privately. If you've got a point, some information, or have a question that we can help with. Having supported the law, the Maine Medical Association feels a very strong obligation to be available to patients and prescribers to help with it. So again, and I would encourage all of you to be involved in your local community efforts to put more treatment. We know there's over 600 Suboxone. We know there's over 600 individuals, licensees, who have gotten their waivers, their X-waiver to prescribe Suboxone. But relatively few of them are seeing a large number of patients with substance use disorders. So again, there is a survey in the field. We're trying to get every one of those 600 individuals to complete a survey for us. If you know people, please let me know, and I can send them the link to them, because we're trying to, again, find out where they are, whether they've got any capacity, what the barriers are to them taking on more patients. Do they have sufficient counseling and support available? Because once you get your X-waiver, you can choose to be on the DEA website or not. And there's only like 270 or so listed on the DEA website. And even then, we've only been able to get slightly less than 100 to fill out the survey, which is a pretty straightforward thing. So we know we need to do a better job. There are estimates that of the number of patients who need treatment and would be willing to actually get treatment if treatment was available. Insurance coverage, of course, is an issue for many of them. So again, the focus now needs to be treatment, harm reduction, and we don't want to forget law enforcement. But again, treatment, harm reduction, and people don't even talk about prevention because it's so difficult to measure, and it's so difficult to look at prevention, get you right into the social determinants of health and the effects of adverse childhood events, poverty, hopelessness, joblessness, really difficult issues that would take considerable resources to fix. And so again, I think that's why you see quite a bit. It was easy for the legislature to limit prescribing. It didn't cost them anything. But when we go in and try to get significant resources for treatment, we've not been as successful. And it doesn't seem to me that Maine's getting its share. It wasn't lost on me that New Hampshire just got $44 million for treatment, and we're getting like $11 million. I don't understand that. So a lot to do. Again, don't forget stigma. I know many of you, are way more involved in that than we are here at the Maine Association. But again, lots to do. Let's not get discouraged. Some of the numbers are getting better, and let's make sure that every candidate between now and November 6th, they've already received our progress report on how Maine is doing. Let's ask them which of these recommendations would they be willing to fund if they're elected to the Maine legislature. So thank you, and Aaron, again, thank you and Scott and AdCare for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for presenting our webinar today. Just a reminder to participants, tomorrow you will receive an email with a link to the presentation recording and the slides, and a link to the CME CEU survey. Once again, thank you, Gordon, and thank you to our participants for attending today. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you very much.